Good afternoon. I'm going to call this hearing of the Subcommittee on Homeland Security to order. As a general reminder, this is going to be a virtual and hybrid hearing. Some of my colleagues are going to be here personally. Some are going to be virtually. We're going to do our best to ensure that everybody has a chance to ask a question when it's their turn. We also are going to have votes at some point during this hearings, and so our attempt is going to be to keep this hearing running and keep coverage here while we also run down to the floor and vote. And I'm glad to be assisted in that effort by the subcommittee's ranking member and prior chairman, Senator Capito. Today we welcome the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, and we express to you our limitless gratitude for the work of the 240,000 employees across the department. We recognize the tremendous risks that they have taken and the sacrifices that they have made, especially during the past year and a half. You and I got to visit, along with Senator Capito, some of these heroes at the border earlier this year, and I know how humbled you are to be able to lead this group. The purpose of today's hearing is to review the department's fiscal year 2022 budget request. We eagerly await the arrival of the full request later this week, but we've got the administration's budget blueprint in front of us, and we're going to use that to guide our discussions today. This blueprint shows us how the department's mission is changing and adapting. New investments in cybersecurity are needed in the wake of these unprecedented attacks on our networks, many of which have consumed the news. The Coast Guard, faced with critical anti-terrorism and drug interdiction missions, is in need of long overdue capitalization. Natural disasters are becoming more fierce and more frequent, and I would like to applaud both you and the President in your announcement on Monday that $1 billion is going to be invested through the BRIC program to help communities prepare in advance for hurricanes, wildfires, and other natural disasters. And as we heard at a hearing on domestic terrorism before the full committee, homegrown violence still presents the most serious threat to our nation today. And today, this afternoon, our heart breaks again as we read news of another mass shooting, this one in San Jose. 8 are dead so far. We don't know the motive, but once again, we are reminded that the most serious threat of physical harm to Americans does not come right now from a foreign army or from immigrants, as some would have us believe, but from the increasing tendency towards deadly violence from a small, often heavily armed subset of our fellow Americans. Now, as for DHS's work at the border, which I trust is going to occupy the bulk of question and answer time here today, let me say a few things before turning it over to Senator Capito. So I understand how important the issue of immigration is to our politics today. I understand that it's a lot easier to use the issue of migration as a political cudgel than to see it as a problem that needs to get solved. And today, Republicans often want to take the increased numbers of apprehensions and presentations at the border and blame it on President Biden. That scores a lot of political points, gets you booked on talk shows. But that's not the truth, and the truth is still important. Migrants, as it turns out, don't really care who the President of the United States is. Why? Because they come here for a complex set of reasons, most of which are connected to life in their home country. Consider this. In 1986, in the middle of Ronald Reagan's presidency, we saw over 1.5 million apprehensions at the southwest border, some of the highest numbers we've ever seen. From 1997 to 2000, we hovered around the same number during the Clinton administration. Then, during the Obama years, despite his policies that allowed some undocumented children and families to stay, a policy excoriated by Republicans as an incentive for migration, the numbers of apprehensions at the border were far, far below these numbers of the 80s and 90s, averaging around 420,000 each year of his term. Then, despite President Trump's supposedly tough immigration policies and the beginning of the construction of his border wall, we saw a surge in apprehensions, highest in over a decade, resulting in a $4.6 billion emergency supplemental in 2019. The bottom line is that President Trump's rhetoric and the cruelty of family separation, it didn't stop people from coming to the United States, because people are coming here in order to flee violence and economic desperation in their home country. The only thing that stopped that surge happening in 2018 and 2019 was the pandemic, when we shut down the border under public health authorities. So what's happened this year? Well, apprehensions have spiked, but that's because some of those blocks I talked about on children and families entering the country ended, and for good reason. President Trump was turning around little kids and throwing them back into the arms of traffickers and criminals. That was an inhumane, un-American policy, and we should all celebrate its end. But also, in November of 2020, Mexico enacted a new law. That meant that they were unable to accept many returns from the United States of families with small children. The Trump administration had ample notice that this law would come into effect 2 months, and they seemingly made no plans. So, as a compassionate nation, we chose to house these families. Yes, some of them have been released from custody with a promise to appear before ICE, but so far in this fiscal year, those that have received a notice to appear before ICE have complied 95% of the time. So this claim that there's some new catch and release policy, it's just not backed up by the data. And I have news for my colleagues. The public health restrictions on single adults that remain, barring them from applying for asylum, cannot by law remain in effect forever. So when that authority expires, and it will, there's going to be a surge of single adults at the border, created by a ban on asylum cases for 1.5 years. That's not anybody's fault. That's the consequence of the pandemic. So I'm a new chairman of this committee. I took the job knowing about the politics that surround this issue, but this committee does have a history, the subcommittee does have a history of bipartisanship. Not every year can we find a way to a budget, but many years, even when the politics were really hot on this issue, thanks in large part to then Chairwoman Capito, this committee did find that path. And so I hope that we get to have a meaningful discussion today about the border and the many other challenges that are facing the department, and I look forward to being able to work across the aisle to try to find bipartisan solutions, at least within our budget authority, to the challenges that you face. Thank you for appearing before us today, Secretary Mayorkas, and I'll now turn it over to the ranking member, Senator Capito, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. While we don't have, as the chairman mentioned, the full budget request, there is certainly no shortage of things to talk about today, and I know you've been on Capitol Hill since early this morning, so I appreciate that. You certainly do have a large job as head of a massive, sprawling department. As I noted this time last year, the department's critical missions include counterterrorism, trade enforcement. You know, we only talk about certain aspects of Homeland Security sometimes, but when you see the massiveness of what you're dealing with, maritime security, opioid and drug interdiction, presidential protection, cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, emergency management, continuity of government, law enforcement training, countering weapons of mass destruction, state and local information sharing, and more, as well as this past year responding to the pandemic. On top of that, Secretary Mayorkas, despite what my esteemed chairman says, your first 100 days have been dominated by a border crisis of the administration's own making. We are currently in the midst of a historic surge at the southern border. There were 178,000 encounters in April, and tens of thousands more entered undetected. Drugs continue, this is a big issue for me. Drugs continue to pour across our border, including record amounts of fentanyl, which are devastating states like West Virginia and killing a lot of our people. Mr. Secretary, you and I traveled to the border a few months ago, and I greatly appreciated your invitation and willingness to do so. I saw all of this firsthand, and the crossings have only increased since our visit. And yet, the administration continues to insist that the border is secure. The facts on the ground that I just described apparently are not viewed as a security or law enforcement challenge, but a more logistical challenge in processing migrants who arrive with no legal claim to enter the United States. Additionally, ICE apprehensions and deportations have plummeted, and more criminal aliens are on the streets as a result. In light of these challenges, the administration's FY22 discretionary request for the department is highly concerning. Despite every other agency receiving substantial increases in funding, the Department of Homeland Security stands alone as the only department held virtually flat from last year. This is highly conspicuous thrift from an administration that has already enacted and proposed trillions in new spending. And even before we get to FY22, we need to get through this current year, this current fiscal year. In FY 2019, during a lesser surge at the border, the administration, and that was the Trump administration, made a supplemental request for funds, and Congress responded by providing an additional $1.3 billion to DHS. This year, we have received no supplemental requests from the administration, despite the fact that we know the border is surging, like the one we're facing now, are placing significant unbudgeted strains on agency resources. The department does have transfer and reprogramming authorities that have been under attack in recent years, but which I have defended when they are used appropriately. So we continue to await the department's plan for financing the current surge. However, if we are facing costs comparable to FY 2019, I'm concerned that attempting to cover such costs from within the department would stretch the intended purpose of its transfer and reprogramming authorities and inevitably strain the shared priorities of Congress and the department. Finally, I must address the border wall construction pause, which violates decades of budget law precedents put forward by the GAO. Vice Chairman Shelby and I laid out in great detail the legal case against this pause. And while budget law may be arcane, the impact of this impoundment on our Border Patrol agents and our country's security, I believe, is very real. Every administration is certainly entitled to their new priorities. It is not entitled to thwart laws that were enacted in previous years on a bipartisan basis. It is not entitled to under-execute on congressionally appropriated funds in the hopes that it can eventually thwart them altogether. Despite all the noise, this committee has a history of working in a bipartisan way to further the mission of the department. When administrations include unrealistic or unjustifiable proposals, we work across the aisle to try to move forward in a reasonable way. That's what this committee does, and I'm sure that's what we'll do again this year. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for not just being here, but for serving. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Following the Secretary's opening statement, each member is going to be recognized for up to 5 minutes. We're going to do it by seniority. I would now recognize Secretary Mayorkas for your opening statement.
Thank you. Is that better? Quiet is one thing I've never been accused of being. But I do want to express our thoughts and prayers for the families and loved ones of the victims of the mass shooting, Mr. Chairman, to which you referred in your opening remarks, the tragedy that occurred in the northern part of California earlier today. The Department of Homeland Security is confronting serious, complex, and dynamic threats to the security of our nation on a daily basis. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we are aggressively pursuing efforts to address our most pressing security concerns, from cybersecurity to domestic violent extremism to the COVID-19 pandemic and more. This is hard work, but that is what the 240,000 colleagues in the Department of Homeland Security do every day. Their dedicated efforts keep our communities safe and secure. And the resources afforded by this Congress help ensure we can effectively meet our mission and recruit and retain our nation's most talented professionals. The President's proposed budget will invest in our broad mission set, including preventing terrorism, securing and managing our borders, repairing the broken immigration system, safeguarding cyber and critical infrastructure, and strengthening national preparedness and resilience. It will provide DHS with the resources we need to keep our country safe, strong, and prosperous. While I am unable to address specific details of the President's budget until it is officially released later this week, I welcome this opportunity to discuss several key agency priorities for fiscal year 2022, laid out in the President's $52.2 billion discretionary request for DHS. This request includes approximately $1.2 billion for border infrastructure improvements to fund modernization of our land ports of entry and border security technology, and to ensure the safe and humane treatment of migrants in Customs and Border Protection custody. It would also support our enhanced efforts to combat the smuggling and trafficking of people, illicit drugs and weapons while providing for more efficient travel, trade, and commerce. We are working tirelessly to rebuild our immigration system into one that upholds our nation's laws and is fair, equitable, and reflects our values. To achieve this, the fiscal year 2022 request includes $345 million for U.S. citizenship and immigration services to address naturalization, asylum, and other program backlogs. The budget request also supports up to 125,000 refugee admissions in fiscal year 2022. To meet the President's bold vision for combating climate change, the discretionary request includes an additional investment of $540 million above the fiscal year 2021 enacted level to increase resilience efforts and enhance pre-disaster planning. It will support resiliency in infrastructure, particularly for vulnerable and historically underserved communities. And it would resource the Federal Emergency Management Agency with the ability to hire additional staff to prepare and respond to the increasing number of emergencies and disasters our nation has experienced. In recent months, DHS has made it a top priority to address violent extremism, which I believe to be the most lethal and persistent terrorism-related threat to the United States today. The fiscal year 2020 request includes $131 million to support innovative methods to prevent domestic violent extremism while respecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. It also supports critical research of the root causes of radicalization, enhanced community outreach, and funding for locally driven efforts. Finally, in the face of increasing cyber threats, it is critical that we promote resilience not only within the federal government, but across the public and private sectors and our critical infrastructure systems. The recent ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline serves as a stark example of this ever-present threat. Our discretionary request includes $2.1 billion for our cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, which leads DHS and interagency efforts to defend against today's threats and build a more secure and resilient future. We will also further strengthen the cyber capabilities of the Transportation Security Administration, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Secret Service, and Homeland Security investigations. The budget also proposes $618 million for needed investments in research and development and innovation across DHS, laying a strong foundation to not just respond to the threats of today, but prepare for and defend against the threats of tomorrow. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I am grateful for your continued support for the dedicated public servants of the Department of Homeland Security and for the work they do each and every day. I look forward to discussing the President's proposed fiscal year 2022 budget in greater detail when officially released, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for appearing before us today. I know it's been a long day having testified before the House as well, so we'll get right to it. I wanted to first ask you a question about enforcement of immigration laws, especially in light of a curiously timed article in the Washington Post from last evening. We've handed you a mess, and frankly, we've handed every recent secretary a mess by refusing to update our immigration laws, despite having opportunities to do so. And so you have to make choices when it comes to enforcement. During the Trump administration, I just couldn't believe the choices that were being made. I couldn't believe the choice to, round up mothers with medically fragile children, separate them from their kids to send them back home. That didn't seem to make America any stronger. You and the President have announced some interim guidance around enforcement in order to make sure that we are, in fact, going after the individuals who are here without documentation that pose a real danger to the country. There was this article last night in the Washington Post that suggested something very different, and I wanted to give you a chance to, both characterize the way in which you are currently choosing to prioritize enforcement of immigration laws and let you respond to that article.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our objective, in fact, our commitment, is a safe, orderly, and humane immigration system. And when it comes specifically to the enforcement realm of the immigration system, we intend to be smart and effective. I worked for 12 years as a federal prosecutor, and what we did with limited resources is assess the threat landscape, the criminal landscape, and decide what is the most efficient and effective way of using those resources to have the greatest public safety impact. And that model is no different in the civil immigration enforcement arena. We are provided with resources. We assess the issue in the United States, and we decide how can we use these resources to have the greatest public safety impact, recognizing that we are working on a landscape of a completely broken immigration system that everyone agrees is broken and that is in dire need of a legislative solution. So on that landscape and with those resources, we will be smart and effective, and we will also be humane.
The characterization in the Post that you're only doing a handful of actions a month, is that backed up by data you've seen?
That data item in the article is something with which I am completely unfamiliar.
Okay.
I will say that smart and effective law enforcement is not to be measured quantitatively, it is to be measured qualitatively. Who poses the greatest public safety threat, and are we dedicating appropriately our limited resources to apprehend and remove those individuals? And indeed, this administration is.
I'm going to try to sneak in two other topics before my time is up. First, I want to talk about numbers of apprehensions at the border. These numbers are very high, and as we discussed, that's for a variety of reasons. But when you ban adult males from being adult single individuals from being able to apply for asylum, those that have legitimate claims of asylum, meaning their life is in jeopardy if they go home, are going to do whatever is necessary to get into the United States. And so my sense is that one of the reasons that these numbers are high is that you have individuals who are making multiple presentations at the border, people who can't apply for asylum, who are desperate to get into the United States because of the risks to their body and to their physical safety back home. Recidivism is a consequence of a Title 42 authority that doesn't allow a lion's share of individuals presenting at the border to apply for asylum. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
I just think that's an important thing for our committee to consider. Turning now to another topic, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about FEMA mitigation. I think it's so important to be able to shift our spending away from disaster response to prevention. My state has a laundry list of projects along our shoreline that not only houses a big portion of our population, but Interstate 95, the Metro North and Amtrak line, in which if you spend a little bit of money up front, we could prevent the next disaster from taking out critical infrastructure, from displacing many of our citizens. The last round of BRIC funding, there was $500 million available, but $3.6 billion worth of projects. So you've made an announcement that $1 billion is going to be allocated. That's in your current authority. Do you envision adding on to that number in the budget request that you're going to make? How did you arrive at the number $1 billion? It seems like even that is probably not a big enough investment to be able to provide the return that we know is available if we put money up front rather than at the back end.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying premise of the BRIC funding is the following, that if we can spend $1 on prevention, we will save much more on the costs of recovery. What we decided in reaching that $1 billion amount was it's a very significant increase. It's a doubling of the prior allocation of resources. Is how much can we increase that amount while also achieving the operational efficiencies that an increase will require. And so programmatically, what can we do? How much can we do at one point in time? And that is how we reached the doubling of that figure. It's an extraordinary program, and I echo your belief that dollars spent on prevention is the most effective and efficient way to spend public resources in addressing the clear consequences of significant disaster weather events.
I'll make one final request and then turn it over to others. One of the issues that get raised in my state on that account is the belief that given the high level of competition, it's bigger jurisdictions with larger grant application authorities that get advantage. And so as we increase the amount of money, which I think is critical, I hope that you'll also work with those of us that represent a lot of small communities, and most of our towns along the shoreline in Connecticut are small communities, to make sure that they are competitive with some of the bigger cities and counties and state applications that come before the agency.
We most certainly will, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with you on the smaller cities. Obviously, a state like mine has all small cities and towns, but have just as devastating effects sometimes. I will say this on the resilience issue. As we're looking to negotiate a larger infrastructure package, the President has asked for resiliency into fairly large amounts. I think it's interesting to note that under FEMA, it's another $1 billion. So it'll cut across all different aspects of not just the transportation sector, but other aspects as well. I'm just kind of making a note of that as I decide what direction to go with my next offer on that. Question on, you said the facts in the newspaper article were not, the data was not, it was, you don't know what that data was. So the data that I just saw from the article was that there's fewer than 3,000 arrests, and that means that of the 6,000 officers, they're extrapolating that would be one arrest every 2 months. What part of the data is incorrect there? That doesn't look familiar to you?
Ranking Member Capito, I am not familiar with the data that suggests that the ICE officer, the relevant ICE officer, conducts one arrest every 2 months.
So you don't dispute that there are 3,000 arrests and 6,000 officers?
I don't have the data at my fingertips,
okay,
but I will provide it to this committee. I will say that the preliminary data that I have received does suggest that we are apprehending more serious criminals, more serious public safety threats than previously was the case.
Okay, thank you.
And that is what smart and effective enforcement is all about.
Thank you. I want to go to the future of Title 42, because I think this is coming up on us quickly. I think the chairman noticed this. You are now able to quickly expel 60% of all family units and single adults using this the CDC's Title 42 authority, and I support the use of that for right now. But we know there are test cases in the courts and others, and you and I have talked about this. When CBP loses that Title 42 authority, how are you going to manage what could be about 6,000, well, what is now 6,000 migrants a day when you can no longer expel 60% of them?
Ranking Member Capito, the Title 42 authority, the predicate for this exchange is that the Title 42 authority is a public health authority, not an immigration policy authority. And so when the public health imperative no longer exists, we no longer can use that authority. And in fact, our use of Title 42 authority is subject to litigation challenge as we speak. We have different resources and different authorities at our disposal. One of them, of course, is Title 8 of the United States Code, which is, in fact, an immigration enforcement authority, the authority to remove individuals who do not have legitimate claims for relief under United States law. I should say one important thing, and that is that not only are we building back our asylum program, but we are building it back better. And in that regard, when I first joined the Department of Homeland Security back in 2009, the average length of time it took to adjudicate an asylum claim from the point of apprehension to the point of final resolution was about 6 years. And that reflects a broken system. So one of the things that we are doing is looking at our regulatory authorities and what we can do to bring greater efficiency to the process and shrink considerably that time between apprehension and final adjudication so that, number one, we have a system that works, and number two, quite frankly, we deliver results as both the applicants for asylum relief deserve and the American public deserves.
Well, and I mean, certainly you're anticipating us. I mean, the chairman even alluded to a surge when this Title 42 disappears. And I'm wondering, along with the surge for the CBP, there's also going to be a surge for ICE. And I'm wondering, you know, are you planning ahead for these kinds of things that you know are going to happen? And what kind of strategic thought is going into that?
We are most certainly planning for it. And as a matter of fact, when my testimony concludes this afternoon, I have a meeting on this very subject with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It is our responsibility to plan ahead. That's what we do every single day and every single year that I have been privileged to serve in the department.
Well, I'm not sure we were quite planned ahead for the number of children that came over when we saw those lengthy stays and more max facilities kind of maxed out beyond what their capacity was. But I'll let that one go. I have one last question in this round related to this. Do you have knowledge of tent cities that have been set up on the northern border of Mexico? And I'm assuming those are set up, I think those are set up for the adults that are waiting for this Title 42 authority to go home to do that surge. Are you aware of that kind of scenario occurring in Mexico right now?
Ranking Member Capito, I am very well aware of Camp Matamoros. It was quite notorious for regrettable reasons for the conditions in that camp. It was a product of the Remain in Mexico policy. We developed a platform for the safe, orderly, and humane adjudication of the claims of individuals who were in that camp, and those individuals are no longer in that camp. And the platform that we developed is actually a platform for the future, a really terrific, innovative use of technology to provide legal pathways for individuals who have claims for relief under United States law.
Thank you.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. And I'm going to move from the southern border and head up north here for a couple questions for you. You and I have had an opportunity to talk about the significance of Alaska's fisheries, the fact that about 60% of our nation's seafood landings come out of Alaska. We got a lot of fish, but we don't have a lot of workers. And so we have been challenged year over year as it relates to gaining adequate workers. We rely on the H-2B visa allocations to help us meet that. Without adequate processing, the fishermen have no place to take their fish. And not only does it impact the fishermen and their families, but the market that is waiting. You kept your promise and delivered in advance of a significant date, which I appreciate as it related to lifting the cap. I've had a conversation with you about some of the limitations of that cap and how it does not directly meet the immediacy of our issue right now, the need for some additional flexibility with regards to those visas. It's been very significant that there is a carve-out for Northern Triangle countries, but again, recognizing that we've got some limitations here in ability to get returning workers. I had asked if you could look further into whether or not we might be able to do something for the balance of this summer, but also more to the long term. This is an issue that is certainly not unique to Alaska, but knowing that we need to be working with one another to address the authorities under H-2B or H-2As to prioritize and address these visa issues as they relate to our seafood processors.
Thank you very much, Senator. Since you and I last spoke, I have delved into the concerns that you express on the behalf of employers in the Alaskan fisheries industry. It is my plan to engage with those employers next week to hear directly from them with respect to their concerns, particularly with respect to the obligation to use returning workers. And I want to make sure that they understand the parameters of that and how broad they are, and to assess whether, once we discuss that, whether that really addresses their concerns and their needs. If not, we will confer internally and take it step by step. With respect to the long-term issues with the H-2B program, I am very well aware of those, and I hope that we can design and implement next year a very different H-2B program that addresses the majority of the concerns with respect to whatever legislative constraints we have.
Well, we'll work with you on that. With regards to this summer, though, I will actually be up in the region next week. I know there is a great deal of anxiety because the fish don't really care what we're doing back here in Washington and what our timeline is. And so being able to process these very, very quickly, we were able to work through some issues with the Serbian consulate, and that has really been a bit of a relief. But we've got some issues that are urgent and immediate, so as soon as you can put some folks to address this, it is appreciated. Let me ask for my second question for a little bit of an update here when it comes to polar security cutters. This subcommittee has been very helpful over recent years with regards to the PSC program to ensure that as an Arctic nation, we actually have vessels in the water that can go through ice, polar security cutters. Last year, there was some discussion about leasing icebreakers. We've had a conversation. I support leasing, but only if it doesn't compromise the Coast Guard's ability to eventually build up and plus up their fleet of Arctic-capable icebreakers. So I know we're not talking about the not yet released budget, but can you tell me how the administration plans to continue this positive momentum on the polar security cutters and commit to prioritizing the PSC program, and that no funds will be reprogrammed from the PCS program to fund a lease?
Senator, we are 100% committed to augmenting the Coast Guard fleet. We recognize the importance of those cutters. We do not intend to compromise the funding of those cutters, and we will lease to the extent that we can, and only as a bridge during that time that we do not have built and owned vessels. It will not be at the expense of that.
Good. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam
Thank
Chairman.
you. Yes, Senator Hoeven.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, of the 178,622 persons that attempted to enter or did enter the United States on the southern border in April, how many are here and how many were returned to their home countries?
Senator, I will have to get that data to you. I don't have the numbers at my disposal, but I certainly will provide the data to you. I can assure you that the individuals who are apprehended and processed and whom we are not able to expel under Title 42 authority in this current environment are placed into immigration proceedings.
Well, and you mentioned Camp Matamoros and that you had a platform for addressing those individuals. Where are those individuals while they're awaiting adjudication? Where are they?
Individuals, Senator, who have made claims for humanitarian relief under the laws of the United States are awaiting the adjudication of those claims in the United States.
Right. But that adjudication, that court hearing date can be out as much as 3 years right now, correct?
Senator, that has been the case for years and years. And if I may, this administration, for the first time, is actually tackling that infirmity of process and working to shorten that time frame for the delivery of justice for the American public and the individuals who make claims for humanitarian relief.
Good to hear that you're shorting the time frame. What is that time frame right now? Because my indication, or what I heard when I was down at the border, is it was still about a 3-year.
It varies considerably, but we are doing a number of different things to shorten that time frame as quickly as possible. One is we are looking at our regulatory authority and how we can more effectively process asylum claims. Two, the Department of Justice is looking at the immigration courts and how we can use that resource to also deliver final results more expeditiously and efficiently.
And where are the individuals while they're awaiting that adjudication? Where are they?
They are in the United States of America.
And how are they, are they released into the public at large, or how do you track and know where they are so that you can make sure they go through the adjudication process?
So those individuals are in immigration proceedings. They are subject to a notice to appear. They have a court date that identifies a location, a time, and a place. And there are individualized determinations whether those individuals should in fact be on alternatives to detention, or whether by reason of what they present from a public safety perspective or a risk of flight, whether they should be detained.
Do you have statistics on how many are appearing?
The appearance rate thus far in terms of appearing at an ICE facility to report has been very, very high, and I would be pleased to provide you with data.
I'd appreciate that. If you could provide, in addition to what I asked initially, is how many have been returned to their country of origin versus how many stay of the 178, more than 178,000 came in April. But then also, if you do have expedited procedures, if you could provide me metrics on how many of those people you actually have track of and appear, that would be helpful too. I mean, this goes to the whole question of, do we have control of our southern border? Showing us those metrics is going to be very important. As you know, we see people coming across. I've been down there, and I think for the public to believe that you have control of that border, they're going to have to see those metrics. Would you agree with that?
Senator, metrics are very important. Data is very important, which is why I'm not exactly sure of the 178,000 figure that you cite. Is that 178,000 apprehensions?
178,622 persons attempted to enter the United States via the southwest border in April of 2020.
I think are you speaking of apprehensions? Because apprehensions at the southern border can also include recidivism.
2020, it should be 2021. I'm sorry, it's mistyped.
Also could include the recidivism to which the chairman referenced earlier. So there may not be unique individuals, and that may actually, if we're speaking of apprehensions, may also include the individuals who are expelled under Title 42 of the United States Code, which is the Public Health Authority.
Where I'm really going with this is showing that you have control of the southern border, both in terms of your plan and your metrics, so we can see, is it working, is it not working, where are we making progress, and where are we not?
We will share that data.
That's really what I'm looking for from you.
Most certainly, Senator. You have a right to that data, and we will provide it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for being here and your willingness to participate in this hearing. Mr. Secretary, as you are well aware of, in combination with good policy, funding is a critical pillar in providing agents at the southern border with the tools that they need to do their job. And I, too, have been there and talked to many of the Border Patrol agents. They're required to enforce our federal immigration and border security laws, and despite the predictable surge of dangerous illegal crossings likely resulting from maybe campaign rhetoric and softened immigration policies, we have also seen reports of a lot of cost increases, which is consistent with many of the Biden administration's priorities in its brief 5 months. Mr. Secretary, what commitments will you give us that any funding allocated to your department for border security and immigration enforcement will be used on proven and logical solutions to resecure our borders and discourage this dangerous influx of migrants?
Senator, you have 100% commitment from me that the funding we will receive and are privileged to receive will be used in the smartest and most effective way of securing our border and enforcing the immigration laws of this country.
And a follow-up to that is, with agencies under your purview stretched thin while combating the border security crisis, I am concerned the other areas of focus may not receive the attention or resources necessary to safely complete missions and day-to-day operations. I'm sure we can agree on the strategic value of the United States Coast Guard and the importance of funding for vessels, aircrafts, and equipment required for these men and women to carry out their domestic missions, such as drug interdiction, migrant apprehension, and with all the additional contraband that we are seeing come across the border daily, do you agree that we should not draw resources away from the Coast Guard, which is a vital partner in the Homeland Security mission, to pay for the unplanned and rising cost of the crisis at the southern border?
Senator, I respectfully disagree with the framing of the question, if I may. I have worked with the Coast Guard for many years, and I have addressed the challenges at the border for even more years, from 1989 through 2001 as a federal prosecutor. The Coast Guard and other agencies within the Department of Homeland Security have a complex and varied and dynamic mission set. And we can accomplish different parts of that dynamic and complex mission set effectively. We can, in fact, interdict drugs, interdict migrants at sea, as the Coast Guard so effectively and nobly does, and address other challenges as well. The United States Border Patrol conducts the interdiction of contraband, the interdiction of illicit drugs, the interdiction of migrants through the use of innovation, through the use of, frankly, the men and women of the Border Patrol themselves. We do varied and multiple things simultaneously, and we will continue to do so effectively and smartly and use our resources appropriately.
Because I'm just very concerned with the Coast Guard and there being funds drawn away from that. And it's very concerning to me because they do play such a vital role. So you can't commit to me that you would not pull away funding from the Coast Guard to accomplish this and to address the rising cost.
I commit to you that the funding that the Coast Guard receives will be used by the United States Coast Guard to most effectively conduct and accomplish its varied missions.
That's it. I'm just concerned that that's going to be drawn upon, and it's too important to be taking that away.
I just, if I may, I don't agree with the premise that we take resources from one mission set and deprive that mission set of its attention to address another mission set. What we have is a very dynamic and evolving landscape, and we address the urgencies that we confront as our mission dictates. And I will not deprive the Coast Guard of addressing the greatest urgency and the greatest priority as the mission requires. And that commitment I do make to you.
Okay, I'm out of time. I had one more question, but I'll just submit it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Let me, before I turn it over to Senator Capito to ask a second round of questions so she can get and vote, let me just associate myself with the original remarks of the ranking member on this question of the increased expenses necessary to handle the numbers at the border. I mean, obviously, this is going to have to either come from other parts of the budget or there's going to have to be a supplemental made. And I share the concern that if it's a transfer request, there will have to be some difficult choices to be made. And I think having a dialogue now, Mr. Secretary, between you and the committee about sort of what those transfers might look like and what impact they may have. I understand your commitment today that you're not going to harm the mission of other agencies is a really important one. I understand there may be some hesitancy to put a supplemental request before the body because of the debate that may stir. But I think early dialogue on this will be really important. Senator Capito.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me jump in front of you so I can go vote. And if I don't see you again, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll see you again, but if I don't see you again today, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the push factors in home countries as a cause for the current surge of illegal immigration. In your testimony, you lay the blame on ongoing violence, natural disasters, food insecurity, and poverty in the Northern Triangle. However, I'm sure you're well aware that the spike in individuals is not from Mexico or the Northern Triangle. And according to CBP's monthly report, nearly 34,000 folks were encountered that were not in either the Mexico or Northern Triangle category. So I'm wondering what you account for that, and how do you, we're getting ready to serve, we already have sent $4 billion in foreign aid to the countries in Central America, but what are we doing to address the rise in illegal immigration from other countries? And we met some of these young ladies when we were together 2 months ago down there from Ecuador, Brazil, Nicaragua, and other countries.
Senator and Ranking Member Capito, it's a very important question, and the strategy depends sometimes on the particular country of origin. And of course, we have seen illegal immigration or irregular immigration from countries other than the Northern Triangle countries and other than Mexico periodically throughout the years and throughout the decades. And so let me cite one example. And you referenced it in your question, is an increase in the amount of migration, irregular migration from Brazil. And the data that I have read suggests that that has been occasioned by the economic conditions in Brazil caused by the pandemic, the closing of businesses, and the loss of jobs. And so we have a particular strategy there that might be distinct from a strategy that we employ with respect to the Northern Triangle countries, or quite frankly, some of the European countries from which we are seeing an increase in migration. Regrettably, the COVID-19 pandemic has afflicted countries all around the world, and the migratory challenges correspondingly, not just for the United States, but for other countries of destination.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask a question on cybersecurity. This is something that I'm very concerned about, and I'm certain that you are as well. You unveiled cybersecurity talent management system and was unveiled in 2019 to not only better align cyber talent with the right operational needs, but to also attract cyber professionals that are terribly or badly needed. I view these as critical to fill the gaps that are going to be required. You talked about the ransomware issue. That's just one small part of it. Believe it or not, we have been talking about this critical need since 2014 when the cybersecurity talent management system was first authorized. When will the cyber talent management system go live? And it's really taken, I know you haven't been there as long, but it has really taken a long time for the cyber professionals to be hired into Secret Service, ICE, CBP, CISA. Where do you see this initiative going?
We are going to have probably the greatest hiring surge in the cybersecurity talent domain that has ever occurred. Working with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security, as well as our management directorate, we have launched 2 cybersecurity sprints. One, of course, was dedicated to ransomware, well before the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which galvanized public attention, and correctly so. Our second sprint is precisely on this subject about which you inquire, which is cybersecurity talent recruiting. I launched a partnership with the Girl Scouts of America. One is never too young to start on a path of success to meet a critical national need. And we have a whole plan that I welcome the opportunity to share with you, Ranking Member Capito, about our focus on recruitment and retention of cybersecurity talent, including reforms to the pay scales so that we can better compete with the private sector.
Well, I know that that is a big issue because they're in great demand across all kinds of spectrum. And sometimes the government has a difficulty. Maybe the government can train everybody so they can go out into the private sector and make a whole heck of a lot more money. I think that's an issue as well. But so I look forward to following up with you on that. And thank you again for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's been a long day for you. A couple more questions. I wanted to let Senator Capito fit in her questions before she left, but if you could just respond to the issue I raised. Again, I think it's a legitimate question as to how we're going to make sure you have the sufficient funds to pay the increased bills, as I mentioned in my opening statement, largely out of control of the administration regarding increased numbers of apprehensions and presentations at the border. What factors go into your decision as to whether to transfer money and make that request to this committee versus come and ask for a supplemental appropriation?
Mr. Chairman, I think it is our responsibility to look at the resources that we have, to see and ensure that we are using them wisely, most efficiently, and see what we can do within the funding that we already have received before we come back to Congress and ask for more. We are assessing that now. I would anticipate that we will indeed seek a reprogramming within the time frame that we are permitted, that we will be before you at the end of June, but that's something that we are assessing right now, and we're very focused upon that. But I think we have an obligation to look inside before we go outside.
Let me ask you to talk a little bit about Senator Capito's letter to you regarding the decision to suspend construction of the border wall. Listen, no secret, I think the border wall is a terrible idea, a waste of taxpayer money, an invitation to continue to seed these illegitimate fears of immigrants that was at the foundation of the president's political endeavors. But the part of the letter I agree with is that when Congress does direct the administration to spend money, the administration has a responsibility to spend that money unless it goes through the processes necessary to apply for a rescission. What I've seen, though, is that the GAO in particular has made some findings about the process used to build the border wall that are pretty stunning. Most recently, GAO found that 10 of 11 congressional requirements connected to the construction of the wall were not fully addressed, including basic things like an implementation schedule, an analysis of alternatives, or even identifying things that might actually impact, whether it would actually impact our border security goals. And so as you're in this review process, have you identified some of the failings that were noted in that GAO report? And do you also, I think, acknowledge Congress's equity here, which is to make sure that, notwithstanding our personal opinions on the wisdom of the funding decision, that there is a responsibility for the administration to either spend it or come back to Congress and explain why they aren't?
Mr. Chairman, number one, we're very well aware of our legal responsibilities, and we are indeed complying with those legal responsibilities. I'm also aware of the GAO report and its findings, and we are studying the work that was done and what we have underway with respect to those findings, and making sure that we do not perpetuate any infirmities of the past.
Yeah, again, a pretty stunning list of infirmities found by GAO, in addition to the fact that the last administration waived a whole host of federal, state, and local laws that would have required a much more thorough vetting of construction activities. I would hope that the administration is taking a look at the impact of those broad-based waivers as well. My very last question is one regarding the the future role of DHS in domestic violent extremism. And we covered this in the full committee hearing. But I was struck by an article that I hadn't read in anticipation of that hearing, but did in Reading for this hearing. It was from back in February, and it was included some cautions from the first DHS Secretary, Tom Ridge. And his essential sort of warning was that DHS's mission is so big that to sort of take on a new focus on domestic terrorism may compromise other mission sets, noting that there are lots of other parts of the federal government, the FBI at the top of the list, that already are doing work in the space of domestic terrorism. This feels to me like an all-hands-on-deck moment, given that it is the primary threat posed to the nation's security today. But in answering critics who may say DHS has so many other things to do, so much existing focus on foreign threats, does it compromise the mission or contradict or make redundant other agencies' existing missions on domestic violent extremism for DHS to get more involved in this space? I'd love to hear your answer. I mean, I'm convinced that everybody should be a part of this conversation. You've got capabilities that are unique. But for those that worry that it'll distract from other missions, what's the answer, and how is the appropriation from Congress going to help make sure that it doesn't compromise the other things you're doing?
Mr. Chairman, a few thoughts, if I may. First of all, I think that in the Homeland Security arena, the threats we face are and have been and assuredly will be dynamic and evolving and ever-changing. And my answer is as follows. One, we should never underestimate the commitment, dedication, and talent and capabilities of the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. Two, what we need to do is ensure that those talented personnel have the tools they need to address the threat landscape and to address it with all its dynamism and changes and evolution. And so, for example, to give a real-life example with budget implications, I sat down with the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and we looked at the fact that when I started in the Department of Homeland Security, the greatest threat, or I should say the most urgent threat, was from foreign terrorist organizations. And then it evolved to homegrown violent extremism, and now it has evolved where the most urgent threat on the homeland in the terrorism environment is domestic violent extremism. But do we have the tools that are capable to address that dynamism? Do we have the infrastructure, and are we resourcing it appropriately? And so one of the conclusions was that we actually have to increase the technological capabilities at the disposal of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis so that infrastructure can address whatever the most urgent threat is. And specific to domestic violent extremism, obtaining, collecting, disseminating to state, local, tribal, territorial partners real-time actionable information while respecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. And so we're actually dedicating the resources, and we will be requesting of this subcommittee resources to build that infrastructure to deal most effectively with the dynamism and evolving threat landscape.
I appreciate that answer. I think it's well thought out. I look forward to working with you on that appropriations request to make sure that there aren't redundancies created with other agencies who have been in this space. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for appearing. We've had a busy afternoon of votes on the floor. I think have meant that a bunch of our members haven't been able to appear. Given the fact that the committee is not going to get the actual detailed budget until later this week, I'm going to keep the record open for questions for 2 weeks from today's date. Ask you and your staff to respond to specific questions that may be brought to you once we have the full budget in front of us. And so with that, this committee will stand adjourned.
Thank you.